Would you risk your life for someone who sees you as nothing? What if that one moment of courage could change your fate forever? On a rooftop high above the city, a 10-year-old boy with nothing fights to save the child of a billionaire who has everything. But when the world sees the truth, one shocking decision will change his life forever. Stay with me, because this isn't just a rescue story. It's a story about fate, justice, and how one act of bravery can rewrite destiny. The scorching sun beats down on the crumbling rooftop of an old apartment complex. The paint is peeling, the concrete chipped and cracked, and the air is thick with the scent of pollution. Below, the city moves at a relentless pace, cars honking, people rushing, everyone with a destination. But up here, on this forgotten rooftop, no one looks, no one cares. The world down below spins with its own concerns, leaving this place to rot, unnoticed and neglected. 10-year-old Malik sits on the edge of the roof, his feet dangling over the side, his bare skin darkened by the sun. He's dressed in torn clothes, his jeans ripped at the knees, his shirt faded from years of wear. His hands are rough, calloused from carrying bags heavier than his small frame should allow. He scavenges for scrap metal, pieces of discarded metal that others would pass by, but to him they are worth something. They are a means to survive. Each scrap he finds is a step closer to a few dollars, a few coins that might buy food for the day. Survival isn't a choice for Malik. It's his only option. Every day is a struggle to stay alive, to fight against the weight of the world that seems to have forgotten he exists. His eyes scan the piles of garbage and rubble, his movements precise, focused. He doesn't have time for daydreams. The noise of the city below drifts up to him, but it's nothing more than a blur of sounds, a cacophony of a world he doesn't belong to, a world that doesn't want to know his name. Across town, in the heart of the city's financial district, things couldn't be more different. In a towering glass skyscraper that glitters like a jewel against the skyline, billionaire mogul Preston Whitmore III sips champagne in the middle of a lavish business gala. The guests around him laugh and converse, their voices dripping with wealth and power. Their lives are a seamless blend of luxury, suits tailored to perfection, jewels sparkling under the lights, and endless glasses of champagne, as if the world was theirs for the taking. At the far end of the room, behind the grandiose curtains that separate the adult world from the child's, Preston's 2-year-old son, Theodore, sits in a room full of expensive toys. The toys are stacked high, colorful, and untouched, sitting in their pristine state while Theodore plays alone. His small hands grasp at them, but they are not enough to entertain him. The toys might as well be hollow, for they are not filled with the laughter or the joy of a child's imagination. The nannies and housekeepers, tasked with keeping him safe, are preoccupied with their own duties, leaving the child alone to wander where he shouldn't be. He takes small, unsteady steps across the marble floors, his bare feet making no sound as he drifts through the penthouse that seems too large for one child to fill. The windows are huge, looking out onto the sprawling city below, but Theodore does not see it. He does not know the life that awaits him outside these walls. All he knows is that he is alone, surrounded by things that do not matter, left to wonder why no one is there to care. 2 boys, worlds apart. Malik, whose every day is a fight for survival, scrabbling for scraps on a rooftop in a forgotten corner of the city. Theodore, surrounded by riches, trapped in a life of isolation in a glass tower that overlooks it all. They are as different as night and day, their lives unfolding on opposite ends of a world that will not even acknowledge their shared humanity. Yet, fate has a way of bringing people together when they least expect it, and in ways no one could predict, their paths are about to cross. A life of struggle and a life of luxury, two destinies that will collide in a way that will change everything. Malik was crouched low on the rooftop, his fingers grazing the scattered pieces of scrap metal. He was always on the lookout for anything that might be worth something, a broken wire, a twisted piece of metal, anything to sell. The sun beat down relentlessly, but he barely noticed the heat anymore. Survival was his only focus, and the city had a way of swallowing everything else. Then, amidst the hum of traffic and the distant shouts of people on the street below, he heard it, a soft giggle. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it cut through the usual noise of the city. Malik paused, his heart skipping a beat. The sound was odd, out of place. There was no child up here on the roof with him. His head snapped up, his body tensing, his breath caught in his throat as he scanned the skyline, his eyes darting across the buildings that crowded the horizon. And then he saw it. A tiny figure, no bigger than a toddler, standing precariously on the edge of the skyscraper next door. The child was too small to be here, too young to be alone. He was dressed in soft white clothes, his tiny body wobbling as he reached out toward a butterfly that danced just out of reach. The child's chubby hands stretched toward the fragile creature, unaware of the danger beneath him. Malik's stomach dropped. The toddler's feet were inches from the edge, wobbling dangerously as if the child were walking on air. One wrong step, one tiny miscalculation, and the toddler would fall, 70 stories to the ground below. Malik's heart hammered in his chest. His mind screamed at him to move, but his body froze for a split second, caught in the horror of the moment. He could see the baby's face, innocent and unaware, filled with wonder as he reached for the butterfly. The child had no idea how close he was to the edge, how fragile his life was in that moment. Malik didn't think. He couldn't. There was no time for hesitation, no time to second-guess himself. Adrenaline surged through his veins, flooding his body with raw energy. His legs propelled him forward, sprinting across the rooftop with a speed he didn't know he had. His feet pounded against the worn, cracked surface, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Each step seemed to take him farther from his life of struggle, farther from the rooftop he knew so well, and closer to something far more urgent. He was fast, but was he fast enough? Malik's eyes locked onto the gap between the buildings. A loose plank of wood lay between him and the next rooftop, his only path forward. It was too far, too wide for any normal jump, but there was no other choice. The fear in his chest threatened to swallow him, but he pushed it aside. There was a child's life hanging in the balance, and he couldn't afford to hesitate. Malik's heart pounded in his chest as he flew through the air, every muscle in his body straining with the effort. His feet hit the edge of the rooftop with a painful jolt, and his fingers barely grazed the metal. For a terrifying moment, it seemed like he might miss entirely. His arms burned from the exertion, but he dug his fingertips into the ledge and pulled himself up, using every ounce of strength he had left. The edge of the building seemed to move farther away with each second, but Malik couldn't stop. He couldn't fail. He had come too far to let that child fall. The wind howled around him, threatening to knock him off balance, but Malik focused on the task ahead. He pushed himself up onto the rooftop, gasping for breath, his body trembling from the effort. His eyes locked onto the toddler, still standing on the edge of the building, just inches away from disaster. The baby's tiny feet wobbled, his hands reaching out in a way that seemed so innocent, so unaware of the danger. But Malik knew better. One wrong move, one small slip, and the child would fall, 70 stories down. Malik moved quickly, but the wind picked up again, strong and unforgiving. It whipped through the gap between the buildings, howling in his ears, and for a brief, terrifying moment, everything seemed to slow. The baby shifted, his foot slipping on the edge. Malik's eyes widened in horror as he watched the child's small foot lose its footing, the world tilting as the baby teetered dangerously on the edge. The scream came a second later, high-pitched and raw, cutting through the air like a knife. It was the kind of sound that sent a chill straight to Malik's bones, a cry of pure terror that echoed in his ears. The baby's body began to fall, and Malik didn't even think. His body moved on instinct, his heart racing faster than his mind could catch up. He lunged forward, his body almost giving out from the effort. But his arm shot out and grabbed the child's tiny arm just in time. The weight of the child's body almost sent Malik sprawling off the edge, but he held on, gripping the baby's arm with all the strength he could muster. His other hand scrambled for purchase, his fingers digging into the cold concrete, but the sheer force of the fall was too much. He was hanging there, dangling off the edge, with nothing but open air and 70 stories of emptiness below them. Malik's heart felt like it might burst. His arms burned with the effort to hold on. He could feel the child's small, frightened body shaking against his, but Malik couldn't let go. He had made a promise the moment he jumped he wouldn't let go. Not now. Not ever. "I got you, kid," Malik said through gritted teeth, his voice hoarse. The words were meant to reassure the child, but they were also a promise to himself. He couldn't afford to fail. He couldn't afford to be the one who let go. The baby's soft whimpers were barely audible, but Malik could feel the fear in the little one's trembling form. It was a kind of fear Malik knew all too well, the fear of being helpless, of being alone, of falling into a world where no one would catch you. But Malik was here, and he wasn't letting go. His fingers tightened around the child's arm, but his grip was slipping. The strain was too much. His body was exhausted, every muscle in his arms and legs screaming in protest. He needed help. His mind raced. He couldn't hold on forever, and the longer he hung there, the less likely it was that he could pull himself back up. But who would help him? Who would come to the rescue? The city was alive below him, but there was no one up here to hear his desperate cry. No one but the two of them, hanging on by a thread. His eyes darted around, scanning for anyone, any sign of help, but the rooftop was empty. He couldn't do this alone. He couldn't save them both. He needed someone to pull him up, to pull them both to safety. But as the seconds ticked by, it seemed like no one was coming. It was up to him, and Malik wasn't about to let this child fall, not on his watch. With everything he had left, Malik took a deep breath, his muscles aching with every movement. He gritted his teeth and pulled. He wouldn't give up. Not now, not ever. The sound of blaring security alarms shattered the stillness of the city. Helicopters hovered overhead, their whirring blades cutting through the air as they circled above the penthouse, casting long shadows over the street below. The world watched in horror as the scene unfolded, the cameras capturing every moment of the crisis. News anchors shouted over one another, broadcasting the terrifying image of a toddler dangling from the edge of a skyscraper, and the heroic figure who had risked his life to save him. The tension in the air was palpable. This was the kind of story that the world couldn't look away from. But inside the penthouse, Preston Whitmore III and his wife Tiffany had no idea any of it was happening. They sat in the lavish dining room, surrounded by the polished elegance of their home, but their focus was elsewhere. They were too busy arguing about the latest business deal, too consumed by their wealth and status to notice that their 2-year-old son, Theodore, had wandered off. The phone calls, the negotiations, the constant pressure to maintain their empire. It all seemed so much more important than the child who had been left alone in a room full of toys, isolated in a world of luxury. When the news cameras finally reached their penthouse, when they saw the chaos unfolding outside their windows, it was too late. The footage of Theodore clinging to the edge of the building, barely held onto by a stranger, was already circulating around the globe. The Whitmores' failure as parents was now inescapable, their indifference laid bare for the whole world to see. Meanwhile, on the rooftop, Malik was still catching his breath, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had hoisted Theodore up onto the building, pulling him away from the edge and into his arms. The toddler was still crying, still shaking from the terror of nearly falling to his death. But Malik couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. He had saved the child. He had done what no one else had. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away. But then, as Malik took a step back, the security guards arrived. The door to the rooftop slammed open, and a flood of security personnel swarmed around him, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What the hell are you doing here?" one of them barked, his hand hovering over his radio. "Is this some kind of kidnapping?" another demanded, his voice laced with disbelief. They hadn't even begun to understand what had happened, but they were quick to judge, quick to see a threat. Malik's heart raced. He hadn't planned for this. He wasn't prepared for the inevitable backlash. He had just saved a life. But now, it seemed like he was in even more danger than before. Theodore, still clinging tightly to Malik's arm, wasn't about to let go. The toddler's small hands wrapped around Malik's sleeve, his cries only growing louder. The security guards, caught off guard by the baby's desperate cling to the stranger, paused for a moment. But their confusion was short-lived. Theodore's voice, though broken by tears, cut through the tension. "He saved my life," the child babbled, his words barely intelligible, but the meaning was undeniable. Malik froze. The world seemed to pause around him. For a moment, everything stopped. Theodore, the child of the billionaire mogul, the very same child who had nearly fallen to his death, was now speaking in defense of the man who had saved him. His words carried the truth, clear and unwavering. "He saved my life," Theodore repeated through his sobs, clinging to Malik as if the stranger was the only person who could offer him comfort. His tiny body shook, his tears staining Malik's shirt, but he refused to let go. The reality of the situation could not be ignored. Malik had risked everything to save Theodore, and now the truth was inescapable. The security guards exchanged looks, their uncertainty beginning to show. The child's words rang in their ears, the weight of the truth settling in. But still, the question remained, would anyone care? Would anyone believe Malik? Would the billionaire, whose son had just been saved by a stranger from the streets, do anything other than cast Malik aside, just as everyone else had done before? Malik's chest tightened as he glanced toward the door, half expecting Preston Whitmore to walk in with the same cold, indifferent attitude he had displayed toward everything else in his life. Would this man, the one who had treated him and his kind like invisible ghosts, care enough to thank him for saving his son? Or would he send Malik back to the streets where he belonged? The truth was undeniable. Malik had saved Theodore's life. But whether the billionaire would see that as something worth rewarding, or whether he would simply discard Malik as another nameless face in the crowd, remained to be seen. The billionaire sat in his luxurious study, the weight of the evening's events pressing down on him like an invisible force. The footage of Malik's daring rescue played over and over on the flat-screen television in front of him, each frame capturing the intense moment when the boy had risked his life to save his son. Preston Whitmore. The third's hands trembled slightly as he watched Malik, a stranger, cling to the toddler with a strength and determination that should have been his. Shouldn't a father be the one to save his child? Shouldn't he have been the one rushing to Theodore's side instead of standing there, paralyzed by his own neglect? The online world had erupted. Social media platforms exploded with outrage and praise in equal measure. Headlines screamed across the screen, "The boy risked his life." Where were the parents? This billionaire doesn't even know his own son. The messages flooded in from all corners of the globe, some applauding Malik's bravery, others condemning Preston for his indifference to his child. The comments flooded his news feeds, and Preston couldn't escape the rising tide of public scrutiny. For the first time, his empire felt like it was crumbling beneath him. The reporters had been relentless. They hounded him for hours, demanding statements, pressing for answers. How could this happen? What kind of father are you? Their questions, sharp and accusing, dug deeper into his conscience. But Preston had stayed silent. He couldn't speak. The weight of his failures was too much to bear. His own child had nearly died, and he had barely even noticed. He had failed Theodore. The truth hung in the air, suffocating him with its harshness. Sitting there, surrounded by the wealth and luxury he had spent a lifetime accumulating, Preston realized something. His wealth, his power, had meant nothing in the face of this. Malik, a boy from the streets, had demonstrated something Preston had long since lost: courage, compassion, and the will to act when it mattered most. He had saved his son when Preston could not even be bothered to notice that Theodore had wandered off. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The kind of man he had become, obsessed with deals, with power, with his legacy, had blinded him to what truly mattered. That night, as the city lights twinkled outside his penthouse windows, Preston made a decision. He wasn't sure what it meant yet, but he knew that something had to change. Something within him had shifted. He couldn't pretend that nothing had happened. He couldn't ignore the boy who had saved his son's life. He couldn't erase the truth that had been laid bare for everyone to see. He picked up the phone, his fingers dialing the number for his assistant, with a sense of urgency that surprised him. The decision had already been made. The questions of reward or punishment were irrelevant now. Preston had to do something, but what that something was, he wasn't entirely sure. "Find that boy," Preston said, his voice calm but resolute. "Bring him to me." His assistant, ever efficient, responded quickly, but Preston wasn't listening. His thoughts were elsewhere, swirling in a mess of uncertainty and resolve. What did he have planned? A reward? Punishment? He couldn't say. The idea of giving Malik a reward felt too small, too simple. It would be easy to write a check and make the problem go away, but it didn't feel right. Malik had done something far more profound than anything a simple reward could cover. It wasn't just about money. It was about recognition. It was about understanding the depth of what Malik had done and what it meant to Preston, to his family, to his son. And yet, punishment seemed even further out of reach. The world had already judged him. The guilt gnawed at him. No one needed to pile on more. He had already punished himself far more than any consequence could ever do. No, this would be different. Whatever he decided, whatever the outcome was, it wouldn't be a typical gesture. He knew that he had to meet Malik in a way that was honest, that acknowledged the gravity of what had happened. He wasn't sure if it was redemption or something else entirely, but he had a sense that Malik's presence in his life would change more than just the course of that night. It would change everything. He sat back in his chair, staring at the phone for a moment longer than necessary. What he did next would matter. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, Preston was ready to face it head-on. The next morning, Malik stood nervously in front of the billionaire's office, his palms sweating, his mind racing. He had never imagined that he would be here, standing in the presence of the man whose wealth and power seemed so far beyond his reach. But now, after everything that had happened, he was here. He had saved Theodore's life. He had crossed the line between two worlds, and now he was about to face the man who lived in that world. Preston Whitmore III sat at his desk, his expression unreadable. The room was quiet, the tension thick in the air. Theodore, still clinging to Malik's hand, refused to let go. His small fingers wrapped tightly around Malik's, and the bond between them felt unspoken, but undeniable. For a moment, it was as if the child knew that Malik had become his lifeline, not just in the literal sense of saving him from certain death, but in a way that reached deeper, a way that tied them together in a way neither of them could fully explain. Preston stared at them, his gaze flicking from Malik to his son. His eyes softened, though he didn't speak right away. The silence stretched out, the weight of the moment hanging between them like an invisible thread. For all his wealth, his power, and his influence, there was something in the quiet of that room that made it seem as if it was all irrelevant. In the presence of Malik's courage, it felt like everything else had faded away. And then, without warning, Preston spoke, his voice clear but filled with an intensity that cut through the tension. "I want to adopt you." The words hit Malik like a sudden storm. He blinked, as if trying to process what he had just heard. The room seemed to hold its breath, the gasps from the staff and those gathered in the room echoing through the space. Malik's throat tightened, his heart pounding in his chest. He could barely catch his breath, his mind struggling to make sense of the offer. The billionaire, the man who had everything, was offering him a future, a chance at a life he had never dreamed possible. Malik's hands trembled slightly as he held on to Theodore's hand. The child, still clinging to him, looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. For the first time, Malik felt something shift deep inside him. This wasn't just about saving Theodore's life anymore. It was about something much bigger, something that could change everything. Preston's voice broke through the haze of confusion in Malik's mind. "You have more courage than anyone I've ever met," he said, his words deliberate, carrying the weight of something profound. "You don't just deserve a reward, you deserve a future." A set of papers was placed in front of Malik, the rustling sound breaking the silence. The deed to an estate, a future, a life beyond the streets. The words on the papers blurred before his eyes, and for a moment he couldn't process what he was seeing. Was this real? Was this his life now? "This is yours if you want it," Preston continued, his voice steady, but filled with an intensity that left no room for doubt. "The estate, the opportunities, the life you've always wanted. It's all yours." Malik's eyes welled up as he looked down at the papers in front of him. His fingers brushed over the ink, but the reality of what was happening hadn't fully sunk in. This wasn't just a chance to escape his old life. This was a chance to build a new one, to start over, to have a future that didn't depend on scavenging for scraps, that didn't rely on a life of survival. It was a second chance, something he had never imagined in his wildest dreams. He looked down at Theodore, whose small hand was still gripping his. The child's gaze was filled with trust, with a quiet understanding that this was a turning point for both of them. It was as if the boy knew that in that moment, their lives had become forever intertwined. Malik swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what to say." Preston smiled, the first real smile Malik had seen from him, a smile that didn't seem motivated by anything other than genuine warmth. "Say yes." Malik looked down at the papers again, then back at Theodore, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest. This was his chance. A chance to leave behind the life of struggle and pain, a chance to step into a future that was filled with possibility. With shaking hands, Malik reached for the pen. The camera faded as the tip of the pen met the paper, and for the first time, Malik's future felt like something he could control. Would you accept the billionaire's offer? Or would you walk away? The question lingered, but for Malik, the answer was already clear.